to have a panel discussion on the topic of moving from despair to hope, the importance of critical emotional literacy. Each panel member will have 6 minutes each. I would like to welcome our four panel members and tell you a little about them. First, we have Catherine Walker from the University of Manchester. Dr. Catherine Walker is a research associate at the Sustainable Consumption Institute at the University of Manchester. Doc. Catherine gained a PhD in environmental sociology from the University College London in 2016. She has researched on children and young people's environmental concerns, lived experiences of environment, and environmental education in India, the UK, and Brazil. She recently received funding to work on a research project called Young People at a Crossroads, which will consider how families composed of first and second generation immigrants from the global south are responding to lived experiences of climate crises in Manchester and Melbourne. We are also joined by Jeni Snell from YouthLink Scotland. Jeni currently works as a Senior Development Officer at YouthLink Scotland, the national agency for youth work, with a focus on youth volunteering, youth social action, and learning for sustainability. Jeni has an MED in Community Learning and Development from the University of Aberdeen and has over 10 years of experience in both voluntary and paid youth work. Jeni is particularly interested in participative approaches that enable young people to have a voice and influence change on key societal issues such as climate change. In her spare time, Jeni volunteers with 2050 Climate Group, the Scottish Third Sector Women's Network, and sits on the advisory group for the YWCA in Scotland. Next is Pete Cannell. Pete Cannell is a founding member of Scot E3 Employment, Energy and Environment, a group of rank and file trade unionists and climate activists that campaigns for a worker-led just transition to a zero carbon economy. He's been involved in political activism for a number of decades and is a teacher and researcher in adult education. And lastly, Amber Dean. Amber Dean is a primary school teacher in Clackmannanshire Council with an interest in climate justice and BLM as well as health and well-being. So today the panel will be discussing the question, in what ways can education for climate justice help us to hope well instead of hoping naively or giving into cynicism? So Catherine, would you like to kick us off?
Yeah, thank you very much, Aisha. And it's a real pleasure and privilege to be part of such a wonderful panel and such a wonderful event. This whole series of 3 events has been absolutely fantastic, and I've learned so much from it. And I think thinking about what climate justice education is, what it can achieve, these events have actually been really formative to the ways that my thinking is kind of progressing on what climate justice is and what it can achieve. I'm speaking from someone as someone who is positioned within the formal education system. I currently do research, but last year I was teaching within a geography department at a university, and I've also benefited greatly from many, many years of formal education. So I do believe that formal education can intersect with informal spaces and can be really formative, but formal education, of course, is not everything. Beyond what I've been privileged to learn and the dialogues that I've been privileged to have with my own students, my own thinking has developed greatly through volunteering, through travel, through speaking and dialoguing at events like this, through reading, not necessarily things that I had to read for my studies, but through reading sort of beyond the classroom. So I really liked what Callum said this morning about climate justice education being both informal, about informal and formal spaces, and also taking place across the life course, because again, I think that's something that these events have shown really well. So we were asked to think about the question of how can climate justice education help us to hope well. And I came up with 5 points, which I've just pasted into the chat. These are obviously ideals. Climate justice education isn't going to do this automatically, but I think climate justice education is capable of these 5 things. And these are things that I drew out from Karen's talk, and which really resonated with some of the other things that have come up across these 3 events and my own experience too. So climate justice education teaches us not to accept the situation that we're in. One of the participants in Karen's study talks about acceptance as the antithesis to action. And I don't want to put young people on a pedestal. I don't want to put undue responsibility on young people's shoulders, but I think this is one way that young people are much better than adults at not accepting things the way they are, because as it was picked up in the chat earlier on, over the years, our experiences can cause us to sort of become quite entrenched in our ways. And so we need to not just sort of think that this is the way the world is and it will never change. We need to be constantly questioning. That's one of the things that Karen said. We need the questioners and the critics within our movements and within our educational spaces to keep us from accepting the situation we're in. But we also need to be able to look for something better. The vision, we need to be able to imagine something different from the situation that we're currently in order to be able to move to getting to that different situation. And this is where imagination is so important. The educator Vygotsky, Leo Vygotsky, talks about children's imaginative play as the first manifestation of emancipation from a situational constraint. So when a child imagines that they're in a different situation, they are they're taking themselves out of what they're in, out of the constraints of what they're in. And again, we need to practice imagination. We need to emancipate ourselves from the situational constraints that we're in. And we need imagination and we need education to do that. And then, of course, education also compels us to look back in order to look forward. I think that's coming across more and more clearly, that climate justice education is about learning from the past. It's about learning about why climate change affects different people in different ways in the present. But we need to be able to look to the past and learn from that in order to move forward and move forward together. Climate justice education also educates us about the challenges and the obstacles that we face. We need to know about how difficult these are, about how entrenched they are, how powerful they are, in order to not put too much pressure on ourselves. Maybe when our first attempts to challenge them don't work, we need to think that it's not necessarily our problem that we took the wrong approach, but actually the challenges and the obstacles are really difficult and they might take a few attempts to overcome them. And then finally, and probably most importantly, education for climate justice cultivates shared learning and radical togetherness. So there's always things we can learn from one another, but we also need to learn to support one another. We need to know that we're not doing this alone. When I did my PhD, an analogy that people kept saying to me was, it's a marathon, not a sprint. And they were trying to be helpful. They were trying to say, don't put too much of your energy into the first part of it. But actually, I think the marathon analogy is not really that helpful, because the idea of doing a marathon, I think, only really appeals to a very small number of people. But maybe if we think of it like a relay, we're passing the baton on. We're never running alone. There's always people who will take it up. There's always people that we've received that baton from. So we need to be learning to support one another. And again, that's where I think education for climate justice can play a role. So I'll stop there, but thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much for your answer. I think we'll hand it over to Jeni now.
I think a massive thank you for having me here today to speak at the session. It's been so informative and I've really enjoyed all of it, especially the youth-led conversation this morning. So massive shout out to all the young people for such a great discussion, and Jaden for joining us at 4 in the morning and with such a powerful talk. So it's been really great. I just wanted to kick off by reflecting. I've been super lucky over the past 6-7 months working with an incredible group of young people from 7 different organisations in Scotland, who last night held a youth climate hustings event with the 5 party leaders in Scotland. And one of the young moderators said something to the leaders last night that really made me think. He said, "You should not be inspired by us, you should be angry and upset." And I just want you to reflect on that just now as well, because I think that's something that's came through really strongly in today's discussions and conversations, is that the anger and frustration that young people feel so viscerally on climate justice is not shared at the same level amongst older generations. So a key takeaway from me is that there's lots more work to do on bridging that intergenerational gap and making sure that the weight of the issue is not solely on the shoulders of young people, and that their voices are listened to and taken seriously in decision-making structures. But yeah, moving on to what I was asked to speak about. So the presentation from Dr. Karen Nairn and the panel question, my initial reaction was thinking about how, as a society, we consider education as a term, and echoing what Catherine just said on the relationship between formal and informal education. I really resonated with Callum's point from this morning of thinking about education more holistically and moving away from that traditional banking model that Freire describes, and recognising the role that informal education plays in supporting individuals and communities to understand climate justice and take action within that space. So I'm a youth worker. My background is in youth work. So I've reflected on the video and the question through a youth work lens, and considered the ways that education for climate justice in a youth work setting can help young people specifically to hope well instead of hoping naively, as was described in the presentation. And for those on the call today who maybe aren't as familiar with youth work, we have three underpinning principles to our practice. So our first underpinning principle is that young people choose to participate. So all youth work is voluntary, and the young people are actively making the decision to be there and to engage in that activity or that process or the project. They want to be there. The second is that youth work must build from where young people are at. So it's person-centered and it's youth-led. And the third is that youth work recognises the young person and the youth worker as equal partners in a learning process. So they go on that learning journey together and dismantle some of those more traditional power relationships that we sometimes see between adults and young people. So for me, those principles really lend themselves to an educative approach that creates the necessary and the optimum conditions to have education on climate justice, and also in a way that recognises and manages the emotions that come with it, such as climate anxiety and climate delay, climate overwhelm. So how does education for climate justice through youth work help young people specifically to hope well? So I think one thing to note is that youth workers are often working in a space with young people who wouldn't normally be accessing conversations on climate justice, or who feel excluded from the subject, or who perhaps because of their personal situations or circumstances have more pressing priorities. So climate change isn't seen as something that they have the time or the capacity to be involved in. And these young people will often be young people who are disengaged from school or formal education settings, or like Jennifer commented earlier in the day, young people maybe from minority communities or communities that are seldom heard, yet those are also the communities who are most likely to be hit hardest by the impacts of climate change. So education for climate justice through a youth work approach is so important for us to consider within that context to reach those young people and to build that realistic, healthy optimism for the future. And a youth work approach does that through engaging young people in a meaningfully participative way. It enables and empowers them to explore their own roles within their local, national and international communities. I mentioned earlier that youth work is person-centered, so we build trusting, respectful and non-judgmental relationships with young people. We create safe spaces for them to engage in critical and reflective conversations that was referred in Karen's video. And those are the spaces, I think, that were referred to in that presentation, where they can connect with their peers and help to strengthen their understanding of the connections between the local action that they're taking in their communities and then global social change on a bigger level. And it helps create that critical emotional literacy, developing their ability to recognise, understand and manage emotions in a safe space. So I'm aware of my time. So to wrap up my three kind of key points on how education for climate justice and youth work would help young people to hope well is one, by creating agency for young people to take collective action, whilst also creating a safe and supported space for them to manage those emotions and recognise and understand them. The second would be to support young people to make connections between local action and global change, and exploring and understanding the impacts of their action in a way that makes it real for them in their communities. And also, thirdly, developing critical thinking, resilience and emotional literacy to balance that acceptance and activism and anger and hope that was drawn out in the video as well. So yeah, just to kind of finish off, I think that education for climate justice needs to be cross-cutting across society. We need to be working together across sectors, and we heard from young people earlier, we need to be working with young people as equal partners in all of this, and build strong partnerships between informal and formal education so that we can create a better future and a culture in Scotland that's for people and planet. And I'll stop there. Thank you so much, Aisha.
Thank you very much for your answer. So, Pete, it would be great to get your response.
Okay, thanks, Aisha. Yeah, I'd just like to say thanks to the organisers of today's event, and it's really great to be here and be involved in this discussion. I just wanted to start with a wee bit of background. I mean, in some ways I feel, as somebody who's been, I was just counting, active in kind of issues around climate change for nearly 6 decades. It was with my first group was a group called Science for the People in 1968, which seems an awful long time ago. And the one thing I really don't want to do is to kind of pontificate against that long experience, because much of that experience wasn't that great, to be honest. But just wanted to bring together a couple of things which I think are important, and then reflect on Karen Nairn's videos. I suppose the first thing is the group I'm involved in at the moment, Scott E3, is kind of predicated on the assumption that we need, as everybody understands, a massive and fundamental way and change in the way we organise our society, but that also that really, for that to be socially just, it has to be something that people do for themselves and rather than is done to them. And one of the things that we've been trying to do in the work we do is to produce and co-produce resources that are actually useful to people who are not maybe necessarily see themselves as climate activists, so they're useful maybe in workplaces, in community groups, among people who are having discussions about climate, but actually don't necessarily have access to a lot of information. So it's about producing material in ways that make it really usable and really accessible, but it actually also speaks to people's concerns. That's one of the first places, I think, where I would kind of link it to both to the issues around education, but also to what Karen Nairn said, because it seems to me that I don't think there are so many people out there these days who aren't aware that there's a climate crisis. I think many people, though, feel kind of alienated from the crisis in the sense that they can't see what's to be done. And when you can't see what's to be done or how it's to be done, then often you kind of push that to the back of your mind. I mean, sometimes you do worse things than that, but you know, it's something so, it's scary, it's difficult. And I suppose, you know, when I think about what the group I'm involved in has done in terms of the kind of educative part of our campaigning and what other people have done as well, it does seem to me that the school student strikes of, you know, a couple of years ago actually did more in a relatively short space of time than we probably have done in you know, much longer than that. Because, I mean, and that's not simply because it was on a big scale and it was young people doing it, but actually young people's relation in society to their parents, to others. And I mean, just thinking, well, I hope she doesn't mind, but I'm just thinking my next door neighbor, for example, who's not a kind of an activist in any kind of way. And my lasting image of her was her being dragged to the last big march in Edinburgh by her kids, who I think are 14 and 10. And the look on her face when she was out there with them, I mean, she's so happy and so engaged, and so much discussion going on in that short space of time. So it seems to me like one of my observations about Cannell's video, which was both a kind of reflecting on things she said, which I think were really important, but which also raised questions for me, I think, is that I find it quite hard to talk about kind of critical emotional literacy from simply the context of the activist group, because activist groups always exist in the real world, in real actual situations, and those situations do change all the time, and they're different for different groups as well. So you know, school students come up against all kinds of structures of kind of power and hierarchy that are particular to the way that young people are treated in our society. But in doing that, I mean, in confronting those things, then the power of what they then do is particularly great. And thinking also about the concept of collective hope that Karen then spoke about. It struck me that is a really useful concept, but it's one that I don't think you can confine simply to the orbit of the kind of group you're in, because the kind of parameters of collective hope are kind of based upon, again, the circumstances in which you find yourselves. And I think Karen pointed out very well that these things are often contradictory. There are circumstances in which the kind of hopefulness and the positive and the hoping well part of it can be really strong, but there are also circumstances in which actually you lead to despair and frustration and anger, that nothing's being done, and all of that for me seems to suggest lots of really interesting connections between what you do as an activist in a group and the way your group then relates to the larger world around you. And sometimes you're not really in control of those things, but the circumstances help for that. I mean, just two examples, one really positive, one really negative. Just over a year ago, I went to a public meeting in Lochgelly, just the other side of the Firth of Forth from me, where about 250 people from the local community were meeting together to talk about the gas plant at Mossmoran. And it could very easily have been a kind of not in our backyard kind of discussion, actually, but it was probably the best discussion I've been involved in about climate transition ever. I mean, there were kind of people from the local community of all ages and backgrounds talking about what it meant to close the gas plant at Mossmoran down, what it meant to look after the workers there, not just throw them on the scrap heap, what it meant to people's lives who are suffering from mental health problems because of the ever-present pollution so they felt, you know, I don't think they had all the answers to what they were going to do, but they had a sense of collective hope and aspiration that had come by coming together and doing things together that was really important, and that was engaging with a kind of wider set of issues around them. And then the other one is a conversation I had yesterday with somebody who's works for National Grid, building the new electric transmission from the wind farms off the Moray Firth. And some of the people are losing their jobs on the North Sea at the moment. And that's a process that's going to have to happen. People are going to move from the North Sea to other places. Some of those people are ending up working on the grid construction. That's a good thing, although it's in a very unplanned and very disorganized kind of way. But they're coming from a situation where their lived experience is really, really negative. Collective organization hasn't been strong. thinking about transition has been about something that's done to you, something that's painful, difficult, full of risk and transition. And all those emotional things make it really hard for them. But they, so these are the lucky ones. They're actually ended up in a new job, but they're still miserable and fed up and finding it hard to work with other people and so on. So there's all of these ways in which the kind of organization and the politics of what you do relates to kind of how people feel and how they engage. And I suppose, that's just to finish, that comes back to, I've worked in adult education for really quite a long time. And one of the things I've been really interested in is how people learn informally from each other. And for me, there's lots of really, really powerful evidence about how really, really serious deep learning happens when you learn from those that you work with, those that are close to you. Often people don't even recognize that as learning. It's living for people rather than learning, but it's actually how we learn many of the most important things for us. And I think that's a lesson that as activists in the climate movement, we have to take back, that it's not about telling people stuff. It's about creating opportunities for them to learn together. So I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Pete. So I think we'll finish off with Amber. Would you like to share your thoughts?
Hi, yeah, thank you. I'd like to just start off by saying thank you for having me here today. And to give you all a bit of a background about myself, I am at the end of my probation year, and I am at the start of my journey with climate activism. And so I'll be reflecting on Karen Nairn's video and discussing the question through a primary lens. And I agree with Catherine when she discusses that hoping well teaches us not to accept the situation we're in. I think education is the best way to bring about climate justice and help us to hope well. Children are young enough to understand climate change, and teaching children from a young age will have an everlasting impact on their daily habits. They will naturally grow up to think about their consumption of fossil fuels and types of food they eat. I have seen glimmers of this in my experience of teaching through inspiring conversations brought about within my classroom. An example recently actually was when I was teaching children about plants and their importance, and we looked at the cycle of growth and the destruction of pollution to our soil and landscapes. All of the children demonstrated an eagerness to learn more and make a change. They were horrified to learn that pollution is part of a cycle that directly impacts humans. I think this conversation inspired us to look at how we might travel to school. And we talked about the best mode of transport for our carbon footprint and use a travel tracker to monitor a trend. And so I think the more education that our children receive about climate change, I do believe the children will grow up to be adults who are more aware of their actions and how they impact our world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So thank you for all the interesting points raised. We appreciate you sharing with us and hope you'll stay with us for the open forum discussion at 2:45. We're now moving to a 5-minute break, so we'll see everyone at 2:45.